So I know a lot of nerds that love The Lord of the Rings, but they don't like the Lord of the Rings novels by J.R.R. Tolkien. But what's interesting to me about that is that they're often sort of embarrassed to not like them. It's like these are absolute classics, and if you're an honest, red-blooded D&D playing nerd and you don't like J.R.R. Tolkien's writing, then you're missing something or just unsophisticated or dumb. Like, here's one comment I saw on Reddit recently, and this guy had just finished The Fellowship of the Ring, and he apologized before he even made his comment. He was like, okay, don't take this wrong way. But what he actually wrote was this. He said, "It's just a chore to me personally to read through these extremely detailed landscapes, especially as a new reader. Every time I start to enjoy the book, he comes out of nowhere with 200 words describing the mountaintops." And this is totally fair, because honestly, if you just crack these books open in 2022, they have some problems. They're dense, they're kind of dry, there's lots of breaks for history and mythology, like the characters will just be walking through a valley and somebody will go, "How about a song?" And then you'll get 5 pages of the song and 10 more pages describing the context of the song. And the usual response from fans is, well, we all stand on the shoulders of giants, and literary standards are different, and J.R.R. Tolkien crawled so that Brandon Sanderson and Robert Jordan and J.K. Rowling could run. And that's kind of true, but it's also only part of the picture. Because if you look at The Lord of the Rings as ordinary narrative fiction, they wouldn't even be that good by the standards of the time. Like, this wasn't Charles Dickens, Jane Austen era where Oscar Wilde was sent to prison for being gay and 10-year-olds were sweeping chimneys. This was the 1950s. There was already really good modern fiction out there. Ernest Hemingway was kicking around, Agatha Christie, Jack Kerouac, John Steinbeck was around. And Tolkien, by contrast, wasn't even a career novelist. He was first and foremost an academic. He was a British linguist who eventually taught at Oxford.
And I remember picking up a paper and actually I nearly gave an extra mark for it, extra 5 marks, actually. There was one page on this particular paper was left blank. Glorious. Nothing to read, so I scribbled on it. I can't think why. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. I think that was eventually published in 1937.
But people got excited about The Lord of the Rings for totally different reasons, and they've endured for a reason, and it's not because they were these page-turning beach reads. And to understand what I mean, let's go back to our video game childhood. And if you didn't play video games as a kid, I'm sorry, just do the best you can. But do you remember the first open world video game that you ever played? Open world. For me, it was this game called The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. It came out in 2002, I think. I was like 12 years old. I rented it from Blockbuster. I put it into my 2002 Xbox. I started playing, and the first thing I thought was, this game is massive. You could go anywhere you wanted. You could just wander off into the woods at random and find a random tomb there with ghosts and its own little story. Like, you could pick up a book off the shelf and it would have 2,000 words of original text in it. There were dozens of languages and cultures and hundreds of flowers and herbs that you could make potions out of. There was just a lot there. And like, as a conventional video game, it was not that great. I mean, the gameplay sucked. I didn't even do the main story because it was just sort of poorly designed and confusing. Like, you talk to a character and they would say, "Go to the old mines to the south of here." And you didn't know if that was across the street or across the planet. But it didn't matter because the world was what you were there for. It was just so rich, you know, wherever you went, there was something there waiting for you. I mean, my little preteen brain almost couldn't believe that this game was real. Now imagine getting that same feeling, but from a book. It's 1954, and you're in the library because Walter Cronkite told you that marijuana makes people gay, and you gotta check it out. And you see this new book on the shelf. It's called The Fellowship of the Ring. It was written by the same guy who did The Hobbit, which you enjoyed as a kid, but still, up to this point, wizards and dragons and elves were still either like academic mythology or fairy tales for kids. But then you find this book that invites you into a world where all of this stuff feels real. And it had actual logic and rules and fleshed out societies and cultures and histories and whole goddamn languages. And it was written in a style that felt like an actual historical document, not Homer, Beowulf, epic poem bullshit or pulp magazine comic book. Like, it felt genuine and rich, and it blew people's minds.
He's never scientific. Even mountains are described by the way they think, which is not a precisely modern idea.
In fact, he's not writing in the science fiction genre, is he? It's more like a glorified fairy story.
The world that Tolkien has created is a world of myth and magic, as well as a world of strange creatures.
People loved the pedantic world building. They loved the history and the mythology and the songs and the 20-page tangents about Hobbit pipe tobacco.
I've always smoked. I sometimes smoke beyond the point when you enjoy it, which is silly, but I do smoke and enjoy it. And as a matter of fact, it's now so tied to writing that I can't write without it.
And I'm not going to say that the story of Frodo and the Ring was just sort of icing on the cake, because it was a really good and emotional story. That being said, I also don't want to say that Tolkien was some kind of genius novelist. He wasn't Hemingway. I don't know if he could have written a book like For Whom the Bell Tolls. But he also wasn't really a novelist. He was a linguist academic who taught at Oxford. I mean, this was just a totally different kind of project for him, and it was one that only Tolkien could have done. It was just this unique combination of imagination and scholarship and passion. And people say that Tolkien really created the epic fantasy genre as we know it. And that's kind of true. I mean, he didn't do it alone. You had C.S. Lewis, and Narnia really helped out a lot. You had people like Lewis Carroll and J.M. Barrie, who wrote Peter Pan. L. Frank Baum, author of the Wizard of Oz series. It doesn't really get talked about a lot, but L. Frank Baum probably created the first really fleshed out fantasy universe. It was kind of a bridge between Carroll's Wonderland and more modern fantasy. But all of these worlds were made for children, which is great, but they also just weren't at the same scope as Middle-earth.
You class him with those other Oxford dons, Lewis Carroll at Christ Church and C.S. Lewis, who both of them created sort of fantasy worlds in much the same way. They were slightly different. They were less substantial than Middle-earth, Tolkien's Hobbitland.
And it's hard to appreciate that now, because now invented worlds are a dime a dozen. I mean, you can't swing a cat at Comic-Con without hitting somebody with their own fantasy world. But imagine being a reader in a time before Tor paperbacks, before Star Wars, before Dungeons and Dragons and Wheel of Time and Skyrim, when the pinnacle of adult fantasy fiction was like a claymation Cyclops. And then suddenly you get the Lord of the Rings trilogy with the appendices and the Silmarillion and the Hobbit. There's just a lot there. And I wasn't around back then, but also I was exposed to these books at an early age. My dad read them to me, and that was back when the only other fantasy that I knew pretty much came from like cartoons and Disney. And honestly, I don't know that if I picked these books up today for the first time, I could really get into them. I mean, I would probably appreciate them academically, but that's something else. But I also think that's what makes the Lord of the Rings movies so great, is that they take Tolkien's project and they turn it into a streamlined, tight, cinematic narrative that also preserved this sense of depth and scale that the books had. Like, I saw the Fellowship of the Ring movie in theaters when I was a kid, and it just blew my little kid mind. Suddenly there was this movie that had all the things that I liked as a kid in a film that felt like it was for grown-ups. It was just so cool and interesting. And honestly, the films might be evidence that Tolkien actually was a Hemingway caliber storyteller, because the Lord of the Rings films are these cultural touchstones, right? But the worst parts of the on-screen content are the parts that weren't connected to Tolkien's actual writing, like the Hobbit films, right? The Hobbit movies were okay, not great, but the best parts of those movies, the best scenes, were the ones that were beat for beat the way Tolkien wrote them. And I am in no way the book is always better than the movie kind of guy, even for sci-fi and fantasy. I think the Game of Thrones TV show was better than the books. I think the Hunger Games was better than the books. I think the Witcher show was better. In Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I think the movie was better than the books. Sue me. But it says something that the Lord of the Rings TV show, The Rings of Power, which had the least connection to Tolkien's writing, it was based on the appendices he wrote. It says something that show was like, not that great. I mean, it was kind of a snooze fest. The characters weren't that interesting. The stakes weren't that clear. The plot was hard to focus on because it was mostly just people standing around explaining their goals to each other. And that's really surprising to me, because you'd think that for $1 billion, you'd get some really top-tier storytelling talent to make your show good. And maybe they did, but what they were trying to do was hard. And that was to create a brand new story in Middle-earth that struck a balance between the sweeping, high-minded universe and relatable characters and plot lines that hit hard emotionally. And they just didn't pull it off. They just couldn't bring Middle-earth to life in the same way that Tolkien did in the 1950s. And of course, this isn't the 1950s, and you're allowed to not enjoy the Lord of the Rings novels. They're not for everyone. Nobody's going to take your nerd card away. I just want to give you some insight into why these books were such a big deal at the time, why they're still a big deal today, and why if they didn't help create the fantasy genre as we know it, you wouldn't have become the dorky, undateable D&D nerd that you are. So thank Tolkien for that.